Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. This evening, we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 16 real briefly, and it is basically two big parables dealing with money, kind of sandwiching a couple of little bits of teaching that Luke kind of tucks in here. So if you remember, a lot of the build-up to this is all about how Jesus is in conflict with the Pharisees because of who he welcomes, and often he tells things and tells parables or tells stories or makes just general teaching with the Pharisees in earshot, almost to like poke at them in a way, and in a way where he knows they're listening and he's saying it to the people who also know they're listening. And it's this conflict and welcome sort of thing. So in the first parable that he tells here in chapter 16, and Luke is again just giving us a bit of a fire hose of Jesus' speaking back through chapter 15, we have a bit of a setting that tax collectors and sinners were gathering around to hear Jesus. And Jesus is there with them, and the Pharisees are mad that he eats with them. And then he starts talking, and then the only sort of break in the action we have from Luke is Jesus told his disciples. So it could be a change of scene, or it could just be linking everything that Luke is sort of combining here from Jesus. So it could very well be the same setting of sitting around a table eating with people that the Pharisees don't like. As we'll see later on, the Pharisees are there listening, even though Luke says Jesus told his disciples. So we have the tale of a rich man and a shrewd manager. So essentially there is a manager of this wealthy man's business, and he's been dishonest, and he is at the brink of being fired. And so he is called into the boss's office essentially and told, you're going to be fired because you're not very good at your job. And so the manager freaks out a bit. He's older, it seems. He's maybe getting near the end of his days, and he says, what shall I do now? My master's taking away my job. I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. So he's essentially suited for middle management, it seems. So he then comes up with this plan that he says, I'll know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will actually welcome me into their homes and be taken care of. And so he concocts this plan to basically forgive, or at least significantly lessen people's debt, kind of whether he thinks he's doing it on the side and gets caught, or what he thinks. But he thinks, okay, I'm going to lose my job here. I've got nothing to lose. I'll build up goodwill with the people. And so he gets them all to come in and say, how much do you owe? Well, let's basically like cut it like by half and half and half again, to where you're not really owing anything. So one person owes 1,000 bushels of wheat, and he says make it 800. One person says they owe 900 gallons of olive oil, and the manager says make it 450. So he's significantly reducing these people's burdens. He's not completely forgiving their debts, but he is forgiving a lot of it, or at least doing some clever accounting just to say, hey, forget what you owe. The sort of benefit of this is that this actually ends up being a shrewd way to do business, and then the people are actually to pay off what they owe, and the rich master is actually pleased and says, oh, that's good, that's actually shrewd, and you've dealt with this actually pretty well, so you're fine. And it says, Jesus says, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with very much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with very much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? So this is quite an interesting turn from Jesus. In other places in Luke, but especially also you have contrasted with this Matthew 19, where Jesus says that you should sell everything you have. So this seems to be kind of a pro-wealth passage, and I'm not going to try and argue with that as much, but we'll move on to a bit where Jesus moves on to in a second. But what he's kind of saying first off is the parable that this manager then begins to act shrewdly in self-interest by being kind to people. And it's a self-interested kindness, but kindness nonetheless. And he contrasts that with the people of the light, which, again, given the context of all of this, is probably the Pharisees who are listening in, who are not kind with their people. And they would never reduce someone's debt, as it were, just to be like, hey, I'm going to be nice to you. You owe this much, or you've done this much with your life. Here, let's call it less. They're always asking for the full amount. And so the first kind of application of that seems to be about the people of the light who are not kind or forgiving, even out of self-interest. But then he talks about doing what you can with your money to kind of impress people. So he says, use your worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself. So what could he mean by this? I think partly he means that pretty much square on the surface. This is a way that people who do have money, who do have worldly wealth, can do with it what is good rather than hoard it. One of the major, I think, points of discourse in our world just now is the wealth income inequality that we have in our world that was significantly increased by the pandemic, and that there were billionaires and billionaires who got richer and richer and richer by many, many times over during the pandemic, while the rest of the world, the rest of people, were kind of left to get poorer and poorer and have our prospects of a good life reduced. And so I think that rather than saying to someone of a fairly normal sort of level of income, that this is about them, I think this is pretty clearly pointed in that direction to someone who has a massive amount of wealth and is using it purely for their own self, in flying around in private jets 30 minutes or whatever, as the European politician was, or Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson flying themselves to the moon. I don't think that is at all a shrewd way to deal with the wealth you have. But even beyond that, let's let Jesus tell us a bit more about what he means. So to go on in verse 13, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. The Pharisees, who loved money, heard all of this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight." So this is really interesting, because just a few verses before he says, use your wealth to gain friends. But here you could maybe see that the Pharisees are doing that. They're using their wealth to show people what people value more highly, but it's detestable in God's sight. So letting Jesus and Luke kind of interpret this for us a bit further is, on the one hand, on its service, use your wealth in a way that is good for humanity, in a way that is kind. But on the other hand is the idea that if you have money, you do have to be very careful that you do not serve your money rather than God. And you do have to watch out that the money you have is not controlling you, because very, very easily money and greed, which the word in the New Testament for greed often literally means have more-ness. It's kind of a sort of actiony kind of word, and it's this just constant desire to have more, and money kind of breeds that in us as people. And so I think a lot of what this is about is not just saying, it's okay, it's cool if you got money, but like, on the one hand, if you got money, you better be good and kind with it, and on the other, you better not let it control you, because I think that is what the Pharisees seemed to be doing according to Jesus and according to Luke. And then we have a couple kind of isolated teachings that Luke tucks in here. The NIV actually does kind of bracket this off as just additional teachings. You can read them for yourselves. And then we have another parable, and this one's really interesting because of the way that we view heaven and hell and the way that we view the afterlife. This is a parable that informs some of the more colorful ways that people look at the afterlife. Ultimately, if you look at it theologically and actually look at places in the New Testament where you're trying to figure out, is the text trying to tell us something about what is actually true about the afterlife? There is very little concrete description. And what description there is often mixed metaphor. So it's either a dung heap or a fire or darkness or nothingness. And how can it be all of those things at once if it's a literal sort of place? Well, we don't know. In this parable, you do see a sort of fiery version of hell. You have a rich man and you have Lazarus, and they have they are together in life, sort of near each other, and there's a beggar called Lazarus. He goes to heaven and the rich man goes to hell, and they have this sort of back and forth exchange, and it gets quite colorful. What I would say about this is that this is not a literal description of hell. This is a parable to teach us something about how we live our lives and about how we interact with the people around us. It's not meant to show us exactly what heaven or hell or the afterlife is going to be like. So that's basically all my comment. Read the parable for yourself. It's a really interesting one, and I think you'll enjoy having a look. But that's all I have for us this evening. We'll come back next week with chapter 17. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.